One of the many beautiful things about React is that it abstracts away the complexity of dealing with native JavaScript API. Today, we can just write components and focus on user experience rather than worry about different browser support. There are, however, still a few use cases when we actually need to get access to the DOM element. And when you need to do this, one of the most crucial things to understand is reactRef. So today, let's take a look at why we would want to access DOM elements from React and how to do it with useRef hook, how to pass ref around, and how to implement imperative API in React. Let's start with implementing a really cool form. Let's say I am organizing an event and I want to receive attendees' names in advance. I would have an input field where people can write down their names and a submit button. And I want my form to be fun. So instead of showing annoying red borders if someone tries to submit it empty, I want to focus the input field instead and shake it a little bit to attract attention. Let's start the implementation with focus. Unfortunately, in React, we don't have anything for it. So this is the time where we would need to remember how to do it in native JavaScript. In the world pre-React, we would have to manually get this input field element through getElementById, and then trigger focus like this. And although technically we still can do it, but React actually gives us something more powerful to access DOM elements: refs. Ref is just a mutable object that we can create with useRef hook. It's similar to state in the way that its value is preserved between re-renders. But major difference is that it's mutable and it doesn't trigger component updates. So don't ever try to use it instead of state. Your app just won't work. Ref is just an addition to state, more of an escape hatch that we mostly use to access DOM elements. When we create ref object, whatever we pass as a default value to the hook will be available as current property of this object. And we can override it in our useEffect hooks or callbacks to anything that we want. For example, we can just assign an object to it. Or we can pass it to a DOM element like this, and React underneath will do some magic and attach the input DOM element to the current property of ref. If we now log ref.current in our useEffect, we will see exactly the same DOM element that we would have seen if we tried to get that input through getElementById. And as a result, such native APIs as focus or scroll into view become available to us through ref.current. Now, if we start to write our form, we will probably do something like this. We would have a form component with some state to store the name and on change callback attached to the input. We would add a submit button with on submit callback. And inside that callback, we would handle the case of empty name. If the name is empty, we would focus the input field and in the future shake it. And in order to do that, we would create a ref and attach it to input. And now we can do the actual focus with ref.current.focus function. We are almost done with the form, yay! Except in real life, I wouldn't write it like this, as a giant component that holds everything. More likely than not, I would extract this input and everything that is associated with input, like its behavior, styles, maybe some additional features, into its own component, so that I can reuse this input in other forms and get consistent behavior and looks everywhere. So our form, instead of thinking how to style input and how it should behave, could just render a component. But what will happen if I do exactly this? Our input will be the one that holds ref and has access to it. But it's actually the form who is going to check the data, not the input. So it's the form that needs to trigger the focus. And I can't easily do it through props, unfortunately. This is an imperative function call that I need to trigger, not pass some data to input. If only we can do something like this. And actually we can, in a way, Ref is just an object, and this object is mutable. So nothing actually stops us from creating it in form itself and passing it to input. Instead of creating this ref in input field, we could create it in form itself, introduce a prop called inputRef to the input field component, and just pass it there as any other prop. And in input field, we would just attach this ref that is coming from prop to the underlying input element. React again will do some magic underneath when the input is rendered. We'll mutate this ref object, and the input element will be available to us through the input ref. And we will be able to use it in the form component just as any normal ref. So what we did here is we exposed underlying input elements to anyone who uses input field component and passes ref through input ref prop to it, which is technically not that good. It's leaking implementation details, but we can fix it later. One question that might come up here is why I named this prop in such a weird way. Couldn't I just reuse the ref name? Because technically it's exactly the same thing that we pass to input element itself. Why name it differently? The answer here is because ref is not actually a real prop. It's kind of like reserved name for internal React use only. If input field was a class component, the ref would be attached to its instance, and we could have accessed this instance through ref.current. But since input field is just functional component, it doesn't have an instance. So if we just do it like this, we will see a warning in browser console and nothing will actually happen. There is, however, a way to make this syntax work for functional components as well. We just need to wrap them in forwardRef function that React gives us. This function accepts a component as an argument and injects the ref as a second argument of the component, right after its props. Now all we need to do is just pass this ref to the underlying input element, exactly as what we did with ref from props. And our form will work exactly as it was before. We won't need to change anything there, other than the prop name. It's going to be ref now instead of input ref. Now that the focus is sorted, what about the shaking behavior? Unfortunately, we can't just do this. There is no native shake function available to us. But we can easily implement this shaking with CSS animation. The easiest way to do it would be to just add animation class name to the input when we want to shake it, and then remove it when animation is done. But again, how to trigger it from form? We could try to do it with props, but it would require a lot of code to sync them with internal state, not to mention that form would have to hold additional state just for this purpose. And we already trigger focus imperatively. I don't want to introduce completely different way to handle exactly the same use case. Again, we need something like input field.shake. And again, we actually can do it. React is declarative, and it expects us to behave that way. But it still gives us an ability to give our components imperative API if we really, really need it. This is where useImperativeHandle hook is very useful. If you look at that hook and its API and description, it looks a little bit complicated. But what it does under the hood is very easy. It just grabs a ref that you pass to it and overrides its current property with wherever you give it as a second argument. If we represent the API that we want to see in our input field as an object with focus and shake properties, it will just assign this object to the ref. Exactly the same as if you would pass this ref to an element. Only in this case, it's not the element that's going to be available when we call ref.current, but our object. From code perspective, it looks like this. It's just a hook that accepts three arguments. First one is our ref that we receive from outside through props or forwardRef. Second one is a function that returns wherever we want to assign to the ref.current. In our case, it's an object with focus and shake functions. And third one is dependencies array, same as any other hook. Now, if we want to implement this actual API, it could look something like this. We would create a local ref that we would pass to the input element, and then we would trigger focus on this local ref in our focus function. And in our shake function, we would just set should stake state to true. And then in our form that has a ref with API and that we pass to input as a prop, we will have access to this API. So in our onSubmit callback, we can just trigger this API. We can trigger ref.current.focus and ref.current.shake without worrying about the internal implementation. And as a bonus, we're not leaking implementation details of input field component to the vault anymore. In theory, we could just replace the underlying input element with anything else. And our form wouldn't know and wouldn't even care, as long as the API stays the same. And our cool form will behave exactly as we want it. Click on the button, will focus input field and shake it. Now, if this useImperativeHandle hook is still a little bit of a mystery, there is a good part here. You don't actually have to use it to achieve exactly the same result. Remember, ref is just a mutable object, and we can actually mutate it explicitly if we want. So instead of this weird hook, we can just manually attach our API object to the ref.current property in our useEffect. Exactly like this. This is almost exactly the same thing that React does under the hood anyway. And the end result will be exactly the same. We won't have to change any other code. Before you get all excited about using ref, just remember, ref is an escape hatch. And in most cases, normal React data flow with props and callbacks should be more than enough. Using ref and imperative API is an exception, not the rule. And it will make your code harder to read and debug in the long run, so use it really carefully. If you want to play around with code examples for all of this, they are linked in the description. And if you feel like reading instead of watching, I wrote an article about exactly this topic that is linked in the description as well. Also, I write quite a lot about patterns like this and more in my blog. Don't hesitate to check it out. Hope you found this video useful and see you next time.